A couple decades ago, I was a newspaper columnist, and I was allowed to write anything I wanted, and I was interested in prison, about which I knew almost nothing. So there's a long, long story to this, but the short version is this, that I ended up getting invited into a medium security penitentiary. This was in Canada. Started writing stories about prison, started learning about prison, ended up falling in love with and marrying a man who was a prisoner, and raising his two daughters, who were very young when I met them, are now adults. And one of the things that happened during those years, I was married to him for 7 years, and all during those years I became kind of a prisoners' rights activist. I started to realize what happened to prisoners' families. I started to be activated to help prisoners' families, including ourselves. But I saw that my girls were so stigmatized and shamed by their father's crime and by where their father lived that they just became silent. And they never spoke about it. And even though they visited him and I encouraged them to stay in close touch with him and kind of made them go with me to visit him a lot, and prison was very much a part of their daily lives, no one would have ever known it. They didn't tell their best friends, they would prefer to break up with a boyfriend rather than tell them where their father was. And so what happened with them was I watched this burden they were carrying just kind of flatten them. And, and I knew that there were other kids around who had this same experience in their lives, but nobody talked about it. So always I had wanted something for them. I wanted some way for them to feel like it was okay to talk about this. I wanted some way for them to feel like they weren't him. They deserved to be listened to and supported and heard, and people needed to know their stories, but nobody did. So cut to, their father and I divorced, and several years later I remarried the man I call my current husband, although I think he's the last one. But he lived in Los Angeles, moved to Los Angeles, and he's a high school teacher. So I began going into his classrooms. I'm a writer, and I was, as part of an organization called P.O.P.S, which is Poets, Essayists, and Novelists, I was under a grant invited into classrooms to work with kids on their writing. And in every classroom he taught, every single classroom he taught, I would start to see, oh, there are kids with this in their lives. There are kids here who aren't talking about this story. But I recognized it, or they would write something just for me that they didn't want to share with anybody, that was about their sister or their brother or their mother or their dad or someone who was incarcerated. So there's a very long story to this, but basically one day, this is really the end of the story, is one day he was talking about a kid in his class who had started talking about her brother who was incarcerated, and that in talking about him, she kind of woke up and felt energized. And when he told me that, I said, we should start a club. And he said, yeah, we should start a club. And it was really that simple. I remember where we were sitting when we said it, and it was kind of this offhand idea. We were thinking of the LGBT clubs because he had, over the course of his 20-plus years teaching, seen the changes that the LGBT clubs had made in students' perceptions of gay and transgender students. And that there was virtually no stigma any longer. And so we spent a Christmas break looking over the model that there was one LGBT club started in 1988 in one school in Concord, Massachusetts. And we looked at that model, and we sort of drew up a little one-page plan. And we took it into the principal, thinking she was going to say no. We really thought she would say no. And she was immediately enthusiastic, which I suspect is because she might have had some experience with incarceration in her life. So one of the rules, the first rule of P.O.P.S, which didn't have a name at the time, was we would eat. It would have to be at lunch hour, because lunch hour was when we could get, when kids could come. You know, lots of kids have to work after school or take buses home or have to babysit or whatever. And before school is way too early for anybody. So lunch hour was it, which meant we wanted to provide lunch. So we made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and we quietly told a few kids at Venice High, hey, there's going to be this club, and it's for anyone who has incarceration in their lives. And the first day, it's my favorite story about P.O.P.S is the very first day, first young woman who walked in the room, 10th grader, walked in, took her peanut butter and jelly sandwich, sat down. Second young woman walked in the room. And they looked at each other across the room, shocked. They, it turned out, had been friends since kindergarten, I think, kindergarten or first grade. They had been to each other's homes. They were actual friends. And they both had incarcerated fathers, and neither one of them knew it about the other. And they kind of ran, you know, it was like one of those slow motion, they ran to each other and threw their arms around each other. And I saw that, and I looked at Dennis and I said, this is absolutely right. This is what we need to do. And thus we launched. That first group, over the first semester, started out with about 8, became 10. By the end of the semester, there were 25 regular attendees. And we thought that come fall, we would sort of not have a club again because a lot of them were seniors. And first thing in the fall, 25 kids showed up. And it's just been growing ever since at Venice.
Thank you for watching A Wise Way. Subscribe to stay updated, share to pass the knowledge, or view our other videos on the left.